The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with author Sue Harrison. I'm Steve Benson. Sue Harrison is the author of the trilogy Mother Earth, Father Sky, My Sister the Moon, and her latest is Brother Wind. Sue, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, first of all, the foundation of all good writing is storytelling. And actually the story of how you came to write this trilogy is a wonderful story in itself.
It was something I wanted to do since the time I was 10 years old. I've wanted to be a novelist since I was a little child, and when I was in my early 20s, I decided I wanted to write about Native Americans. I read the book Roots by Alex Haley, and that inspired me towards writing about the roots of Native American cultures, a time when those cultures were growing and spreading across North and South America, and I was very excited about, and always have been, about Native American cultures. So that was basically my inspiration. I started research first and did a broad general research of all the cultures across the United States, and narrowed in on the Great Lakes area because that's where I was born and raised.
Upper Michigan.
Upper Michigan, and I realized after several years of study that I was going to, if I really wanted to write about the roots of Native Americans, I needed to go to Alaska. I needed to study Alaskan tribes because all the tribes came from Alaska one way or another down into the rest of North America. So I started studying Alaskan peoples, came across the Aleut tribe, their culture, their language, their stories, and fell in love with that tribe. And my first trilogy is about the Aleut people.
And of course that wonderful harsh countryside where the sea and the wind and the very harshness of where life is always on the edge.
Definitely. It's called the land of fire and ice, and that is definitely what the Aleutian Islands are, and the Aleut people have adapted perfectly to this environment and made a very successful adaptation, using the marine mammals as a food source and the sea as the source of their life, and islands where there are no trees, where there's often a 70-mile-an-hour wind. And to live in that kind of climate just kind of boggles the mind, to be able to successfully survive there. And they did that.
And when you first began to write, you of course hadn't been there, and in fact you didn't go until after the first novel.
No. You have to kind of realize that I was just doing this from my living room in a little tiny town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, very isolated. And there was a big part of me that never really believed the book would ever see publication. It was more of a labor of love. It was something I was doing because I love to do it. And thank goodness I have a husband who believed in me and believed in me doing this and didn't have any problem. It was a great hobby.
And it was hard to find a publisher.
It was very hard to find a publisher. It took me 5 years to find a publisher. From the day I sent out the first query letter trying to find someone interested until I actually got a phone call from New York City that a publisher was going to buy the book. It was 5 years.
What was the starting point? Was it the image of the land or was it the language?
For me, it's usually the language. I'm very interested and excited about languages. And when I'm going to study any people, I try to study their language first. I'm a novelist first. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not an anthropologist, although I've studied those areas of those studies very, very intensively. And I wanted to have the language of this book be right, and the language is very important to me. So I studied the Aleut language, and I studied neighboring languages of the North, Native American populations, in order to give me an idea about the people and what is important to the people. You can learn so much about a culture by studying people's language.
And tell us about that language, because as we were discussing before the program, the way that they put the subjects and the objects and the verbs is very different than regular English syntax.
Right, right. It's, as a little Aleut child told me just recently, we were in the Pribilof Islands working in the school systems there with the Aleut children, and one of them said, well, the Aleut language is backwards, you know. Well, it's not really. I think English is backwards, but I will say the objects of the sentence comes first in the sentence, and all the nouns. So if you were going to say, my mother needs milk for the baby, you would say, baby, milk, mother needs for. And so the objects, and then the subject, then the verb, and then all the prepositions. So you're getting right to the point of the sentence right away. So it's backwards that way for those of us who've learned English first. But there's also an important aspect of any language, and that is the rhythm of the words. In English, our rhythm is basically it's an accent on accent rhythm. So we say, Mary had a little lamb. In most Native American languages, the rhythm, and I've certainly not studied all Native American language. There are thousands of Native American languages, but the ones I have studied, the rhythm is a rhythm like this. It's a on accent, accent. So it's, that's the rhythm you get. And so as I constructed my story, I tried to keep this rhythm, even though I'm using English words to write this novel, tried to keep the rhythm of the Native American languages.
And these, of course, were oral traditions. They weren't written down probably
Right.
until modern contact times, except for, of course, tribes in Central and South America. So that language, too, is the kind of driving force that keeps stories alive through generation after generation.
Absolutely. Storytelling is more than just literature. It's a theater art. And the best storytellers among Native Americans were ventriloquists, and they were actors. And you have a real disadvantage when you're trying to translate this onto a written page. That's a flat two-dimensional surface, but you can get the rhythm and you can get the excitement of the stories.
Because these are people that live so close to nature, those natural forces, whether they're the elements or animals, also take on very strong lives of their own.
Yes. For Native Americans in their cultures, they believe that everything has a spirit, animate and inanimate, rocks and trees and everything, the sky. And there's a great spiritual depth to their living as a result of this, and also a great respect for nature. And I think that's something that we in our American culture can learn, is that tremendous respect. It's gotten us into a lot of trouble, the fact that we don't have enough respect for our environment and for nature. And I tried to bring that out in my novels, even in the titles of the novels, that we need to respect the environment.
Let's hear one section, and from your third book now, Brother Wind.
This is from the center of the book, and each of these books has as a main character, and as not perhaps the main character, but a main character, is an ivory carver. And in Brother Wind, this third book, the ivory carver is Waxtell. And Waxtell is a villain in this book. He's a villain, and he's part of the reason, part of one aspect of him being a villain is that although he has talent, he abuses his talent, he misuses it. So we're going to learn a little bit about Waxtell here. Waxtell cradled the carved tusk in his lap. It was cold against his legs. All things were cold: wind, ground, grass. He held his hands over his hunter's lamp, but even when he lowered his fingers into the tongues of flame, he could feel no heat. I am like some spirit, he thought. I long for heat, but am unable to enjoy it. Then, as though the thought had given him new eyes, he asked, what if I am dead? Could this cold, this hunger have pulled away my life? He began to shake. Again he held his hands over the oil lamp flame, and again he felt no heat. Perhaps those spirits who in his first day of fasting had added their carving to his tusk, had taken his life in trade for their work. Waxtell's throat tightened and his chest shuddered with the full hard beating of his heart. But then he thought, what man, dead, feels his heart beat? And suddenly he knew he was not caught in the world of the dead, but in some vision. Why fear what I have been praying for, he asked himself. The spirits have granted what I asked. He had planned to fast for 4 days and nights, 4 the sacred number of the earth, of the 4 winds. He had brought 4 water bladders, 1 for each day. 2 were empty. He picked up the 3rd and drank, and as he drank he asked himself, what spirit drinks? He pulled his carving knife from its packet and held the blade over the tusk. What better time to carve than during a vision? He closed his eyes and let his thoughts go free. He carved as his mind filled with pictures of many things: a fine large trader's ick, a cormorant feather cape, a necklace of bear claws, a mask carved from wood and painted in bright colors, a large eulach with food caches full of meat and oil.
Even though this took place 9,000 years ago, it's still part of the timeless rhythm of people today.
Yes, it almost has to be, because of course I'm writing from my base in the 20th century, and that's what I know. So.
And those objects, like the 4 bladders of water, presumably they're still part of an Indian culture today.
Yes, yes.
That language is carried throughout all of the novels. I want to go back to the character in the first novel, Shagak, who is this wonderful child, a child on the verge of becoming a woman, who's confronted with a terrible catastrophe, wants to die, but yet she has to go on.
She is one of my favorite characters. She's who I would like to be. I think, not that I would want all this tragedy to happen to me. In the first chapter of the book, she loses her entire village of people, including her the young man she is to marry and her parents, and she has a very happy relationship with the members of her family. But the fortitude with which she meets this crisis, and her decision to go on and to live, and then later on in her life her decision to risk loving again in spite of the possibility of loss. I like that about Shagak, and it's what I would hope my own reaction would be.
And the quest, again, Shagak is forced to go on a quest,
yes.
as Waxtell is trying to, in sort of a deformed way, is trying to go on a spiritual quest.
Right. All of the characters, I guess any novelist can tell you that the basis of writing a novel is you get your characters and you get their personality set in your mind as a writer, and then you give them a problem. And the more insurmountable the problem, the better chance you have of writing a novel that will grasp the reader and pull them in and let them live the story.
You also have a very strong sense of taste. Presumably that's where some of your own archaeological research has come into, finding a place that will work.
Yes, it's. I was very fortunate, especially with the first book, to read a little book called Aleut's Survivors of the Bering Land Sea Bridge, and it was written by Dr. William Laughlin, and he is an archaeologist based now at the University of Connecticut Storrs, and he has discovered this village site at the time of his discovery back in the 1970s. It was the oldest village site known in the North American continent, and so it was something that I could base my research on and base for the foundation of my novels, is how their homes were constructed and what kind of utensils they used and what they ate. All of these things were available to me because of Dr. Laughlin's research.
This is a culture too. They live in a harsh land, and the few material things that they have often are invested with tremendous spiritual as well as materialistic value.
Yes, and it was an interesting thing for me as I progressed through this trilogy to show the growth of the culture as they grew from a smaller village to a larger village, and to show how materialism can creep in. How the objects that they had, the ivory that had once had a great spiritual significance, carvings and everything, came to have significance as trade objects, and how that in a way corrupted some of the people's lives. There was I could see a correlation in our own culture, and I enjoyed working this through the plot.
Each of your novels also has a list of terms and terminology and costumes. Perhaps you could read just a bit of that for us too.
Sure.
Give us an idea of what these people value and how they're used.
I have some of the Native American words. Most of them are Aleut words that I used in the book. Shigak is the name, each character that I allow the reader to go into the mind and actually see their thoughts, read their thoughts, has an actual Native American name, a name that is a Native American word. A shigak means obsidian in Aleut, and obsidian is a sacred stone to the Aleut people. Was used it has a very good conchoidal fracture, so they can use it for arrowheads, and well, they didn't have arrows in those days, but spearheads and harpoon heads, and so there was a lot of significance to the obsidian, and it's a beautiful stone too. It's smoky black,
and also very hard. And again, this girl who has to confront these incredible challenges has to be hard to survive.
Right. That's right, and so that's all seen in her name, and that's the reason I chose that as her name. A chigadach is a waterproof, watertight parka. It's made of the intestines of sea lions or the tongue skin of whales. And for some of the tribes or the villages that were located on the actual Alaska Peninsula where there were brown bears, they could use bear intestines too. And the intestines are split open and scraped, so there's just like a translucent piece left, probably about this wide. And they were sewn with a watertight seam. It's a double seam. It's almost like a French felt seam for any of our seamstresses out there, and or a flat felt seam, I mean. And they were sewn in horizontal strips, and it made a wonderful waterproof jacket that was tied with drawstrings at the wrist and around the face, and again around the hole where the person sits in the kayak. So it was a watertight seal. A person could flip their kayaks completely over, and the only part of the body that would get wet would be the hands and the face. And a man's life depended on his wife's ability to make him a good chigadox and make a good watertight seam. So men and women were codependent, and you'll find that women had a very important place in society. They weren't looked down on that much.
Shigak also wears a suk. It's
yes.
made of bird feathers, which was
right.
a wonderful, wonderful object.
Yes, and it was. It had a high collar rim, and it was long, probably mid-calf. And that way, since most of the people on the islands went barefoot, if you got a little bit cold, you could just crouch down a little, and the sook would touch the ground, and it would give you a little shelter for your feet. The climate on the islands is very wet, and snow would come and go. It would melt as often as it would stay a couple days and then melt. And so everything had to shed water, and of course bird skins with feathers still on them are great for shedding water. And you could also turn the sook inside out and put the feathers on the inside, which would hold body heat, trap the body heat better. So if you had a really, really cold day where you had snow and it was a harder, less wet snow, you could turn the garment inside out and have it warmer. If it was a wet day, you could turn it with the feathers out and it would shed the water. So.
Tell us a little bit about how you went about establishing relationships and how relationships were between men and women, children. Obviously, no one has been around. There are no written records from 9,000 years ago. Did you sort of abstract from current Aleut culture, or did you also insert, I sense, a bit of modern feminism as well?
I did not intend to insert modern feminism. I think maybe where that comes in is just the fact of that what I did discover in some legends and myths that were passed down, that the women had a very strong voice in many native cultures, and that comes through in the novels. What I did was I studied the current Aleut culture and also the current Inuit or Eskimo peoples and their cultures. I would say in historic times, like in the 1700s when the Aleuts were discovered by the Russians, and then in the 1800s when we have good records of white traders and missionaries going up into the Inuit lands and dealing with the people, and tried to see where there were similarities. Because the Inuit people, the women were not as dominant as in the Aleut people. And at one time, these people were one. And they feel, a lot of anthropologists feel that the Aleut and the Inuit split about 9,000 years ago, which is about the time of my novel. And so I had to decide why the women of the Aleut culture became basically on an equal footing with the men as far as their place, and how that came about when that did not happen with the Inuit people so much. And so it was speculation on my part, but it was a studied speculation, and tried to compare and contrast environmental differences and what, you know.
And also ways of confronting this incredibly harsh environment again,
yes,
responding.
Yes, definitely that. And there would have been influxes of other tribes into the Aleut islands, perhaps from the Japanese islands, the islands of Japan.
The second novel, My Sister the Moon, is based on an incest legend.
Mm-hmm. It's a very popular legend among Aleut people. When you stop to think that the Aleut people live on a 1,400-mile long stretch of land that extends almost from Asia to North America. It's a big curve of islands. And throughout these islands, of course, there's some great variety of legends. But this legend seems to be common in one form or another among different islands along this stretch.
Quickly, what those common elements are.
Well, a brother and sister, and that there was in some times they love each other and want to be together, and in some cases the brother is the villain and he attacks the sister. And the end result of them having sexual relations is that they are turned into sea otters, and they jump into the ocean. And in one legend, they're turned into the sun and the moon. And so it was this legend that got me thinking, okay, what might have been the beginning of this legend? If you base it in real life, what might have happened? And that's the basis for My Sister the Moon.
And of course, the legends that you've interwoven, not always with the Alaska Natives, but presumably drawn from other North American Indian cultures.
Yes, many cultures, the Cree and the Ojibwe and the Dakota and the Pueblo, many, many different cultures, because we're talking about prehistoric times, and it's possible that legends over a period of 9,000 years could have passed into many different cultures.
One of the things that's absolutely delightful about your trilogy is the way the circle is completed, and perhaps you could read the epilogue.
Okay. I can find it here. Shagak tightened her arms around Taka and Shuku. Almost she could believe she held Amagi and Samak. Why did something so long ago seem so close, as though she could reach back at will to days long past? She closed her eyes and listened to the evening sounds of the Yulach, the scrape of Cayu's lava rock against a spear shaft, Samak's voice as he spoke to Owl, the clatter of wood dishes as Three Fish, Keen, and Kukatuks put away food. They all carried the sorrow of Small Knife's death, but with each moon it was better. Who could not feel joy when so many babies had been given them? Shuku and Taka, Many Whales, and Hunter, and the new baby that Keen carried in her belly. So tell your grandsons a story, grandmother, Keen said, and sat down beside Shagak. Shagak laughed in her surprise, but who could know what Keen would ask next? Her joy in being wife and mother seemed to shine out from her face and glow through her words. Each day brought a new idea, some way to make the Yulach stronger, the food better, clothing more beautiful. And now she wanted a story. "A story," said Shagak. She smiled at Keen and at Samak, at the others sitting in Kayu's ulach. She pressed her cheek against the top of Shuku's head and closed her eyes. Songs, prayers, and women's chants came into her mind, but no stories. "I do not know any stories," she finally said. Then the otter's voice came, a teasing voice that spoke in Shagak's mind. "Ah, little grandmother," said the otter, "everyone has a story, and all of us are storytellers." Shagak looked up into the shadows that shifted and moved above the oil lamp. Then she tilted her head, as though she listened to something others did not hear. Finally she spoke, and her words were in the strong, clear voice of a storyteller. 6 days, she said. The hunters had been gone 6 days, and during that time there had been a storm, rain, and a roaring that seemed to come from within the mountains, and waves that swept the beaches bare.
And of course, that's the beginning of Mother Earth, Father Sky.
Right. It's the first book.
You've had a chance now to share these stories with the people in the islands, and I understand that your books are great sellers there.
Yes, it was a great time. We had, my husband and I visited the Pribilof Islands at the invitation of the Pribilof School District. They have 2 schools there on 2 of the 2 habitable islands, and one school has 40 students and the other has 120, K through 12. And I was invited to come as part of their visiting artists program, and this is a fabulous program. These children are, the Pribilof Islands are in the middle of the Bering Sea, and these children are isolated. The villages are 400 and 120 people. The 2 villages, so you can see it's a very tiny place to grow up, and so
and you become a celebrity when
yeah.
you visit.
The superintendent wanted to bring in people to share the arts with his children, and he had read my books on his vacation this summer, and he called me from Alaska and said, "Would you be willing to come?" And I said, "Oh man, we can't turn that down." My husband and I said, "Guess what? We've got an opportunity, an invitation to go to the Pribilof Islands." And so my husband and I went up in September, and I worked a week at each school, taught creative writing, K through 12. We talked about stories and how you develop characters, and it was great. And when we got there, we found that they had our books, and they sell them to the tourists that come in mostly from Europe.
It must be wonderful for you to be able to maintain those ties now.
It was great, and we made friends, and I think they'll be lasting friendships, and it was an incredible experience. It was just...
Sue Harrison, I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Sue Harrison is the author of the trilogy Mother Earth, Father Sky, My Sister the Moon, and Brother Wind. I'm Steve Benson for a discussion with author Sue Harrison.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.